In a well-known passage in the Talmud of Shabbat 21b, the Talmud poses the question, "My Chanukah, what is Chanukah?" which seems a strange question to pose since the rabbis of the Talmud and anyone studying this passage, of course, knew what Chanukah is. By asking the question, however, the Gemara creates an occasion to pronounce on the normative meaning of this holiday as celebrating not military victory, but rather a miraculous intervention in light of the temple's oil lamp lasting 8 times its expected duration. The meaning of Chanukah, in other words, was contested, and in an all-important battle for meaning, the rabbis would have their say. My intent in this paper was, and still is, despite Professor Stampfer's announced title, to discuss the changing nature of Jewish patriarchy in Eastern European Jewish modernity. But this assumes that Jewish society was, and I would say very much still is, patriarchal, despite the tremendous changes in the status of women in modernity. That is, in fact, the point of this paper, that forms of Jewish patriarchy varied in the 19th century, with new variants created, but that Jewish patriarchy morphed, persevered, and even gained in strength. Professor Stampfer's assertion that East European Jewish society was not patriarchal is related to questions which Moshe Rossman has raised based on evidence that women in modern Eastern Europe exercised agency in the economic sphere, but also in culture. Professor Rossman mines evidence from women's separate sphere in traditional Jewish culture, citing in particular the studies of Chava Weissler on the Tchinis, and asserts contra Iris Parush that women had social power, as evidenced, for example, in the significant proportion of households which appear in tax rolls in the 16th to the 18th century as headed by women. While such women lacked, quote, the political rights in the community, unquote, meaning, I would stress, that they had no say in the governance of the Kehillah despite wealth, they bore responsibility for people in their households and toward the public economy and polity, unquote. I find this characterization strikingly analogous to the situation of Jews in Christian Europe altogether. That is, Jews were tolerated and even favored over Christian elites because they could not translate their wealth into political power. Does that mean that there was no Jew hatred? Does the fact that Jews had agency, wealth, and in certain aspects definitely power, that is certainly how peasants perceived Jewish arrendators, some of whom were women, who collected taxes and other exactions, does this negate the fact that Jews were an oppressed, subjugated group? Nobody would argue this, and the same is true regarding Jewish women in patriarchal society. Much of Professor Stampfer's denial of East European Jewish patriarchy stems from dictionary definitions and examples of quote-unquote patriarchy drawn from other societies which do not apply to Jewish society in Eastern Europe, as he himself notes. And from a focus, I would say an overfocus, on the literal definition of the word patriarchy as a system of rule by biological fathers over children and wives. Professor Stampfer argues, for instance, that fathers in traditional East European Jewish families did not monopolize authority over children, over whom mothers also had a great deal of authority, particularly, and not surprisingly, or I would say coincidentally, when children were minors. Nor, he argues, could male heads of families simply force their wives to do their bidding. He cites in particular the halachic norm against marital rape, and to me, the far more significant and seemingly paradoxical power over sexual relations, which rabbinic law puts into the hands of women, who determine when they have ceased what the rabbis consider to be menstrual bleeding and are sexually available to their husbands. He argues further that most men had little real authority over women in religious life, which he defines as kashrut, which women adjudicated or, if in doubt, brought to a rabbi, not to a husband, for decision. But the ultimate authority on questions of kashrut was a man, adjudicated by a male halachic system. Moreover, in this comment, Professor Stampfer defines religious life as the kitchen. Would he ever adopt this same definition for men? Professor Stampfer argues further that a man could not simply lord it over his wife because Jewish women could refuse a husband's order and demand a divorce, unquote. Divorce was indeed very common in Jewish society in the 18th and 19th century, as Sharon Fries has demonstrated. And Professor Stampfer says, quote, many of the cases of divorce were because women demanded them. I don't know if we'll ever be able to determine what percentage of divorces Jewish women demanded they obtained. But the historical record, including that of Jewish women's conversions in the 19th century, is rife with cases of denied gittin, or women abandoned by husbands and left chained. Is it conceivable that if women were involved in the elaboration or even the adjudication of these systems, they would have created a rabbinic system of marriage and divorce in which they were objects but not subjects of law? And this is not even to go into the issue of discriminatory property and inheritance law, in which a great reform occurred that accounted women half a man for purposes of assuring some inheritance. Professor Stampfer dismisses definitions of patriarchy that refer to politics and political structures inapplicable to Jewish society because of the Jews' minority status. Life in the home, he writes, did not prepare Jews, by which he means males, patriarchy anyone, for roles in the church or in the government because Jews had no roles there. The Jewish rabbinical establishment was not hierarchical in the same way that the Roman Catholic Christianity was. Rabbis derived their authority, he asserts, by being elected by their fellow Jews. The clincher from my perspective is his throwaway remark, true, communal life was limited to males, but its nature was very different from the political ideal that was found among many non-Jewish thinkers. This in a paragraph that speaks of rabbis elected by their fellow Sikh Jews, when Professor Stampfer has just said that women, 50% of the population, were not allowed any such function and did not in fact vote for rabbis even if they were wealthy. True, communal life was limited to males, but as if we have a trivial exclusion here. In this statement, we have encapsulated the very definition of Jewish patriarchy. The fact that the authority structure of the Jewish community differed from that in other societies is completely irrelevant and in no way diminishes the reality that Jewish society was patriarchal, just in different Jewish ways. And given all we know, why would this surprise us? Jewish society was different from that of the Christian majority in multitudinous ways. The males to whom communal life was limited but were the fathers of the community. The men who composed and commented on and defined and enforced halachic and ethical standards were the fathers of the community, down to deciding if a woman's chicken or vagina were kosher. Any version of the reverse, women ruling on male actions or urogenital discharges, conceivable? Professor Stampfer cites the distinction between authority and power about European Jewish life and concludes that women had power but no recognized authority in Jewish society, which fact, he claims, complicates the utility of the term patriarchy. It doesn't complicate it, Shaul, it defines it. The fact that definitions of patriarchy derive from other societies don't fit the Jewish reality in no way negates the reality of Jewish patriarchy. The lack of fit argument reminds me of the claim of Heinrich von Treitschke and others that Jews had no history because, quote-unquote history, because they lacked the criteria for such, these being a state, an army, warfare. Criteria derived from European experience formed the universal to the Jewish other. Jews were said to lack politics, statecraft, diplomacy because they lacked a state. An absurd claim for anyone with passing familiarity of the internal workings of the Kehillah, never mind the complicated dealings of the Kehillah with Gentile authorities on which the very existence of the Jews depended. To be useful, categories have to derive from the experience of the societies and the phenomena being studied. A similar argument to Treitschke's about Jews was made to deny that Jewish women have a history. Using criteria derived from male Jewish experience and elite experience at that, Jewish women were said to lack a history. After all, Jewish women lack an articulated past, a literary or intellectual history and legacy. No less an authority than Jacob Katz made this argument to Chava Weissler in their famous exchange about all this. But much of Professor Stampfer's career has been spent exploding precisely this proposition. The parameters of Jewish patriarchy have been so well laid out so many times by so many. This is not the place to rehearse the utterly androcentric lens of normative and formative Jewish texts and institutions from the beginning of recorded Jewish history to our times, and the seemingly endless ways that women are made objects of the male gaze and male authority and power. Jewish women, as women in any patriarchal system, are others to the male norm. This defines patriarchy. Professor Stampfer says, where there was power, it complicates the utility of the term patriarchy, but it doesn't at all. Women who are subordinated in a systematic way are not powerless, they're subordinated. Even slaves are not powerless. Prisoners are not powerless. Powers of the weak is the title of the social critic Elizabeth Janeway's work on this subject. Jewish women in patriarchal Eastern Europe or elsewhere were not Stepford wives. In an extensive analysis I did of women's sphere depicted in the first volume of Pauline Vengerhoff's Memoirs of a Grandmother, I argue that women in traditional East European society exercise significant power in the inferior, derogated sphere which patriarchy allowed them. Their power, or perhaps more accurately, the grounds for enacting that power, were not despite patriarchy, but because of it. Women's power existed and operated at the behest of patriarchy. Women operated creatively and sometimes expansively within that sphere, whose reality is not to be construed as anything but creative adaptation to the limits patriarchy imposed, and crucially, to the utter male derogation, the contempt, which was the entire basis for the creation and existence of women's separate sphere. Women's power in that sphere does not negate the reality of patriarchy. It's an outgrowth of it, a necessary one. For the functions which patriarchy assigns to women are crucial. Women need agency in order to carry them out, and patriarchy obliges. Considerable, even shocking latitude could be and was accorded women in the hierarchically inferior sphere to which patriarchy assigned them. The picture indeed is very complicated, but this does not mean there wasn't a picture. Take, for example, the education of girls and women, progress about which is unquestionably an indication of improvement in female status. Arguing for it has been a centerpiece of all feminist agitation. And yet, education for what? In the classic analysis of Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, we saw education, elite education, used as a finishing school and an adornment for middle-class American women who got it, who were not only not supposed to use their education professionally, but who were actively discouraged for using it for careers which might give them financial independence and status, in other words, power and authority. In the Jewish case, we know that formal Jewish education for girls, the famous breakthrough of the Beis Yaakov schools, was instituted as a bulwark against assimilation and the perception that girls were more likely to leave traditional life than boys because of their lack of Jewish educational grounding. But fighting assimilation meant education and socialization for women's traditional roles. While aspects of secular and vocational education were given at Beis Yaakov, the school's mandate was and remains culturally conservative, very much inculcating students with the value of traditional subservience as enablers to men. Students were not just socialized to this role, they were given dynamic, inventive celebrations of it, which graduates of these schools championed and champion to this day. We see this dynamic taken to extreme in the phenomenon which Tamar Alor documents in contemporary Israeli Haredi society, summed up in the title of her book, Educated and Ignorant, Ultra-Orthodox Jewish Women in Their World. So, is patriarchy complex? Would anyone argue that girls and women should not receive formal education? But does getting it necessarily mean a diminution of patriarchy? Let's remember who approved Sarah Schneer's initiative, without whose approval the effort would never have gotten off the ground, the Rabbi of Belz. Professor Stampfer cites a definition of patriarchy as a social situation where men are dominant over women in wealth, status, and power, and a patriarchal ideology that explains and justifies this dominance. And he rejects this as overly broad. According to this definition, he asserts almost every non-egalitarian society would be termed patriarchal. If every human or family pattern society is patriarchal, then the use of the term doesn't add anything to our knowledge when it's applied to a given society. But other terms are equally broad and similarly include phenomena that are not only varied but even contradictory. Think of the term anti-Semitism. As so many scholars have shown, behaviors encompassed in this term are mind-bogglingly varied and even contradictory. Jews are capitalists par excellence and communists, tribal and cosmopolitan. 19th century anti-Semitism included theological Jew hatred and anti-Christian anti-Semitism. Jew hatred from the conservative political right, the center, and the left. It was religious and militantly secular, elite and mob. Do we dismiss the term anti-Semitism because it refers to a complex phenomenon with internal contradictions when this was the reality? Notably, Professor Stampfer doesn't pose an alternative for patriarchy. Instead, he concludes with a position I would share that Jewish patriarchy in Eastern Europe was different from that of other societies. In the remainder of my time, I want to sketch variations in Jewish patriarchy in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Changes in the structure of Jewish family life in modernity have been noted for a long time. Jacob Katz noted that the Hasidic movement weakened Jewish family life by accentuating a new, encompassing male sphere centered around the tzaddik and his court, which accorded no space or place to women, a point that Ada Rappaport Albert further demonstrated. Hasidic men abandoned families to spend the Sabbath and festivals at the Rebbe's court, profoundly disrupting the home-centered observance that was the bedrock of traditional patriarchal Judaism. These trends became pronounced and had significant social consequences as the Hasidic movement took off numerically. Male-centered religious life became accentuated in Hasidic society. Androcentrism, in other words, received a significant boost in Hasidism. For all the differences, a similar dynamic took hold in Lithuanian Jewish society with the invention of the lomdim and a new type of yeshiva, no longer local, but in centers to which students would travel far from family and community for years of study before and after marriage, which with profoundly disruptive effects on traditional family life. The Musar yeshivas, which also promoted full-time male scholarship and necessitated women's responsibility for the family livelihood, induced a similar dynamic. Here we have several major changes in family patterns in the 18th and 19th century in which male dominance was accentuated. The models are new, all are inimical to the pre-modern traditional Jewish family, and all certainly are patriarchal. Responsibility for supporting the family to enable males to engage sacred study may have created, in Moshe Leib Lilienblum's characterization, Amazon Jewish women, but the phenomenon was the product and in the service of Jewish patriarchy. A third major change in modernity came in that segment of Jewish society which adopted the ideal of the bourgeois family on the Western and Central European model. This model upheld the ideal of the domesticated woman who left the world of commerce and money-making to men and made the home a refuge of peace and harmony for men and from the demands of making a living and of a harsh, often Jew-hating world. Such women were to make of homemaking and child-rearing not just a default preoccupation, but their celebrated profession. Marion Kaplan's Making of the Jewish Middle Class in Imperial Germany richly demonstrates the nature and functions of this family type. This type of family was quintessentially modern and utterly a product of the middle class status, which typified Western and Central European Jewries by the middle of the 19th century, though hardly that of the increasingly impoverished Jewries of Eastern Europe, which could not afford to dispense with the productive labor of half the population. Yet, despite this socioeconomic reality, the ideal of the bourgeois family had Eastern European proponents, the maskilim, and it also had a social reality. The maskilim turned on Jewish women the very critique of commerce and money trades that friends and foes of Jewish emancipation alike leveled against Jews altogether, that these pursuits corrupted and rendered perverse their Jewish practitioners. Paula Hyman, Marion Kaplan, and others have shown how the anxieties of the male communal leadership in European communities about Jewish assimilation were thrust onto women, whom these leaders blamed for assimilation, that there was no evidence to support the accusation. Indeed, as these scholars have shown, the reverse was true. In excoriating the supposedly corrupting influence of commerce on Jewish women, we see Jewish male projection of a major anti-Jewish stereotype onto Jewish women, who are made to bear, as it were, the cross of modern male Jewish anxiety about acceptance by bourgeois Gentile society. What is this but an exercise of vast power by the male shapers of modern Jewish opinion and policy on the lives, economic, and personal autonomy and the psyches of women? The maskilic ideal of the domesticated woman and of Jewish men becoming manly by going out and supporting their families did not remain only an ideal in Jewish Eastern Europe. There was a segment of that society that was middle and upper middle class, those Jews who were the beneficiaries of Tsarist policy that Benjamin Nathans calls selective integration. Overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, male Jews, merchants, financiers, industrialists, with significant wealth, graduates of Russian institutions of higher learning, army veterans. One of the prime privileges of selective integration was the grant of residence privilege outside the Pale of Settlement in such cities as Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Jewish financial and political elite was concentrated in particular in St. Petersburg, home to the Ginsburg dynasty and other private Jewish banking houses. These men had families. It is here among wealthy Jews who resided in the cities just enumerated and in Minsk, Odessa, Warsaw, Krakow, Lemberg, that we should look in systematic study for middle-class family patterns, prominently including domestication of women. We get some confirmation of the patterns we would anticipate in this stratum from data from St. Petersburg, where Nathans reports that Jews displayed a far higher ratio of dependent family members, that is, not servants, to those gainfully employed than did the population as a whole, even within the same profession. So marked was this disparity that in its commentary on the 1881 census, the city council complained that the city's Jews, with their high proportion of dependents, were predominantly consumers as opposed to producers, thereby perpetuating in the capital the allegedly parasitic role they practiced in the Pale. Nathan shows that a far lower proportion of Jewish women in the capital were employed, 24% in 1897, than was true for non-Jewish women, 46%, and that this percentage was far lower than for Jews inside the Pale, that is, for poor Jews. And he noted in his response, and he notes, in his response to the official attacks on dependency among Petersburg Jews, the demographer Mikhail Soloveitchik argued that the practice of going off in search of a living is practically unknown to the Jewish woman, and with few exceptions, the circle of her activities is limited to the family setting. We have one full-blown first-person account of the domestication of a woman previously productive outside the home in the memoirs of Pauline Vengerov. Vengerov's husband, Hanan, was an upwardly aspiring Jew of wealthy background, as was she. Although Vengerov worked in her in-laws' inn as a newlywed, toiling hard in her description and with obvious pride in her utility, at a certain point in his anxiety-laced effort to rise financially and socially, Hanan began to insist that Vengerov cease business activities. Hanan ended up a commercial banker in St. Petersburg, in an occupation, in short, unlike a family business in which a wife could play no role, aside from that of keeper of the domestic hearth to host Hanan's business associates, which indeed she testifies doing. Even in radical movements, Zionism, socialism, women did not rise to leadership positions proportionate to their numbers in the movements. Their roles continued to be restricted by gender stereotype. Women were a third of members in the Bund, but only 20% of leadership positions, and far less than this in the Zionist movement, despite its secular and, in some variants, socialist orientation. Here, in Paula Hyman's word, women remained adjuncts. The pattern of subordination persisted even in the Shoah. Even women who had fought in the underground ghettos of Warsaw, Bialystok, or Vilna were commonly denied entry into partisan groups and were stripped of their weapons when they were allowed, in rare cases, to join, because of prejudice that only men could be combatants. Here, too, as was in the case of the Maskilim projecting onto women the negative judgments of the larger culture about the allegedly corrupting effects of commerce, we find projection onto women of the larger culture's prejudice about the Jews' supposed incapacity for combat. What to make of all of this? Clearly, while Professors Stampfer and Rossman have focused on power, I focus on authority, and argue that not just that women did not have this, but that models of male authority shifted, modernized, and in doing so, gave themselves a new lease on life and new power in modernity. Haskalah introduced a new competing authority model to that of the traditional rabbinate, a new elite. But both the old and the new elites were male. While there were a few maskilot, that is, women writers in Hebrew, the movement was not only overwhelmingly male, but continued male privilege in pronouncing on ideal norms, however different these were from the traditional ones. Indeed, I would argue that this, the constancy of male authority, was a reassuring familiarity in a time of tempestuous change. It is unimaginable that Haskalah would ever have gotten off the ground had women been prominent as its leaders, and that unimaginability tells us much. Established patterns of patriarchy persisted in modernity, and new ones came in. The old ones did not simply morph into the new ones, though in some sectors of society they did, as we see in Vengerov's case. Rather, different patterns coexisted simultaneously. All, however, were patriarchal. What remains constant in this picture is male agency of those innovating, as much as those in charge of perpetuating traditional forms. Forms changed with tremendous consequences, but the basic power to determine new social forms remained male. It was for women to accommodate. This does not mean that women were simply passive. Human initiative is always far more complicated than the binaries of sheer domination and subjugation would suggest. But it is absurd to propose that however women accommodated to these realities, with whatever inventiveness and assertion, they were operating free of male-set parameters. In conclusion, I would cite the words of Sharon Fries and Paula Hyman, who cite the, quote, paradoxical status, roles, and images of Jewish women in Eastern Europe, and say they were at once subordinate and domineering in the family, conservative and revolutionary in their politics, pious preservers of Judaism and engines of acculturation. Unlike their sisters in the West, they participated in economic and public life, but were simultaneously excluded from formal leadership positions in the synagogue and community. I had a whole segment on women's creativity within and collusion with patriarchy, but that's another paper, so I'll stop here. Thank you.